Right, so we're now at 11:30, the scheduled time for the next presentation. It's by Daniela Sammler, one of my co-organizers of this event. Daniela, as many of you would know, is research group leader for the neurocognition of music and language group at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt in Germany, and was formerly for a long time at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, and is maybe still affiliated, and that's in fact where I know her from. And some of the work that she's presenting today spans those different places. And the title of her talk is Solo and Duet Neural Bases of Piano Performance. Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you, Peter, for this introduction. And thank you for everybody for being here and to listen to what I have to say about our newest work on the neural basis of piano performance. And the first thing I would like to say is that this was a very tight collaboration with Peter, actually, with Giacomo November, with Roberta Bianco, Natalie Kohler, and Katarzyna Gubnowska in my group. So we know a lot about the cognitive processes and neural structures that enable us to perceive music. Today, I would like to focus on music production, where far less is known. And I would like to present three aspects of music production that we are interested in. So we consider music in the context of a broader context of human cognition. And we consider music in the first place, me coming from the language background, as a combinatorial system. That means notes and chords are arranged according to specific rules, both horizontally and vertically. Of course, music in the production domain is also a motor sequence. And music is sometimes, but not always, done alone. Most of the time it's done in groups. So we have a third aspect that comes into play when we are studying music production, and that's the aspect of interactional synchrony. Today, I would like to present three studies that have been partly published very recently, one last week and one was published 3 weeks ago. So a lot to be read outside. I would like to talk about these intersections. And the first study to start with will talk about the intersection between the combinatorial system and the motor sequence in solo performance. And this is a study that was conducted by Roberta Bianco on what we call the action hierarchy in music production. So over the years, and this is not new, Roberta and us, we developed a framework of a music production hierarchy with the idea that is drawn from general action theory, that music production happens at at least two distinct planning levels. We do have musical structure that not only influences the way we listen to music, but we argue that it also influences the way we produce music. And as you can see here in this tree structure, elements early in the sequence can have influence on elements later in the sequence due to this hierarchical structure. So structure is a planning level that extends over an extended temporal timescale. At the same time, pianists or musicians not only have to plan the structure, what is played, but they also have to decide how to play it, which fingers to use. Particularly in piano performance, there's no strict key to finger mapping, so pianists can decide which fingers to use to play which chords. So they have a motor layer of action planning that is, as we believe, much more serial and less hierarchical compared to the structural plans. And these two levels, we believe, interact. So musical structure influences motoric choices of pianists. And essentially, this boils down to a very old problem that was raised back in 1951 by Carl Leschly, who argued that this is the essential problem of serial order. The existence of generalized schemata of action which determine the sequence of specific acts, which is the structure, acts which in themselves and their associations seem to have no temporal balance. I could give you plenty of evidence in our past work that there are these two levels of action planning, but today I would like to focus on the questions how these levels of planning are represented in the brain. And for this, we developed this MR-compatible piano together with Blüthner in Leipzig and sent our pianists to the scanner to perform what follows. This is the paradigm, a real-time imitation paradigm, in which pianists have to imitate chord sequences, 5 chord sequences that are presented on screen in the form of photos of a hand. And these sequences are actually normal cadences that can either end in a structurally regular chord, a tonic chord, or in a structurally irregular chord, in this case, a Neapolitan chord. So this is the baseline block. And Roberta matched this block or compared this block to a so-called structure block. This block is identical to the baseline block. So here you see it's the same chords, same fingers. The only exception is that we reduce the structural context. So the first 3 chords are omitted, which gives pianists less structural information. So the prediction of the final chord will be less strong, and also the surprise when encountering this irregular chord will be less strong. So the idea is that we would see brain areas that are involved in structural planning in a statistical structure by context interaction. So stronger brain activity for the irregular chord, but particularly in the baseline block in these long sequences. As a second manipulation, Roberta also included what we call a motor block. The motor block, again, is identical to the baseline block in terms of musical structure, also this time in terms of sequence length. The difference is the last chord is played with a non-standard fingering. So that's a motor violation, we reckoned, that should trigger brain networks that are involved in motor planning. So we believe that the main effect of fingers should show us a motor plan formation in pianists. Okay, let's see what the results show. First of all, the structural planning. What we see is indeed a brain pattern and also a pattern in response times, where pianists are slower and show higher activity when they have to imitate an irregular chord compared to a regular chord. And this is particularly the case in these long sequences where they have a rich music structural information. These areas are located in the anterior inferior frontal gyrus, BA47 for those who are interested, and the middle temporal gyrus. And this is actually a network that has been shown in various domains for structural planning. In speech, for example, has also been shown, at least what the inferior frontal gyrus is concerned, for action planning in everyday life actions and so forth. We also did DTI analysis, so connectivity analysis, and we found that these 2 brain regions are interconnected mainly via the ventral pathway, the inferior fronto-occipital fascicle here in orange, less robustly via the arcuate. You see here it is a bit interrupted. So the IFOF down here is the more robust pathway. And interestingly, the fractional anisotropy of this pathway correlates with the interaction that we see here in the response time. So correlates with the structural planning of pianists, and it is a positive correlation. So we argue that we have identified ventral frontotemporal network that is involved in abstract musical structural planning. The networks for the motor plans look different. To cut a long story short, this shows the main effect of non-standard, greater standard fingerings of the final chord. You see massive activity increases in parietal regions, in frontal regions, although it's not the same frontal regions as in the structural planning. I will get back to that. These areas are interconnected via a dorsal pathway, the first branch of the superior longitudinal fascicle. So in short, it's a different network. It's more like a motor network, a dorsal frontoparietal network. To sum up this first study, we identified 2 planning networks, a dorsal motor planning network and the ventral structural planning network that actually, is the interesting point, converge, and they both converge in the lateral prefrontal cortex. Interestingly, and this is in line with theories of action control of prefrontal cortex organization, the structural plans seem to be located much more anteriorly, BA 45 and 47, compared to the motor plans that are more posteriorly located, more towards the motor areas in the pars opercularis, BA 44, and the BA 6 precentral gyrus. This corresponds neatly to models of prefrontal control that argue that higher level, abstract, more extended, temporally extended representations of actions are represented more anteriorly in prefrontal cortex. And we would argue that prefrontal cortex is actually a hub that is crucial, perhaps, to transfer structural rules to movements in music production. Having that said, let's move on to the second part of the talk, talking about duets. So we have motor sequences and interactional synchrony. And this is a study that was conducted by Natalie Kohler, a PhD student in my group. And she was interested in self-other integration and self-other segregation during joint musical action. And all of you know that making music together is a balancing act. So pianists or musicians not only have to precisely control their own actions, but at the same time, they have to map these actions and match these actions with actions performed by others, and they have to adapt accordingly. This is extremely challenging, and it cannot be done easily at the same time. So pianists set priorities on whether to focus more on self or more on the joint performance on the others. And what is little understood so far is how pianists balance this, and depending on what. There are sensory aspects, there are cognitive aspects, there are social aspects, who is leader and follower, which I'm not going to talk about today, that determine this balance between self and other. And Natalie was interested in the question of the neural basis that balance the self-other integration and segregation. And for this, she used the MR piano and had pianists perform duets together. One pianist in this scanner played the melody of Bach chorales with the right hand, and the duet partner outside played the bass line with the left hand. They were connected auditorily via headphones. And the manipulations in the design were as follows. So first of all, Natalie manipulated the temporal compatibility between partners. So she induced slight keystroke asynchronies or not in these partners to check how mismatching auditory feedback influences self-other integration and segregation. A second manipulation was the familiarity manipulation. So whether pianists were familiar with the partner's part, meaning that they had practiced the partner's part beforehand, or they were unfamiliar. So be reminded, they play with the right hand. Our pianists in the scanner, they play with the right hand, either not knowing the part of the partner, or they know the part of the partner, they don't perform it, but they have the knowledge. Okay, the question is whether these two manipulations would influence self-other integration and segregation. Let's take a look at the familiar greater unfamiliar contrast in the brain. So first, be reminded, they were always playing with the right hand. They were hearing both voices, bass line and melody. The differences here that we see here in these contrasts can only emerge from the knowledge of the partner's part. So first thing, what we see is an increase of activity in motor and premotor regions of the cortex and the cerebellum. And when we use these regions as seed regions in a functional connectivity analysis, a PPI analysis, we see enhanced connectivity between these motor regions and plenty of auditory regions, Heschel's gyrus, planopolar, temporal pole, and so forth, in both hemispheres. So despite the fact that they are always only playing the right hand, we see stronger activity and stronger functional connectivity in cortico-cerebellar audio-motor networks. And we argue that this increase in activity and connectivity reflects a motor simulation and potentially the anticipation of the auditory feedback of the partner. And this is done by virtue of an internal model of the partner's action. Okay, what about the second manipulation? So I said that Natalie induced subtle temporal asynchronies between partners. And these asynchronies had an effect, not a main effect on partners, but they had an effect only in the conditions when pianists were familiar with the partner's part. So when they had internal models of the partner's part and could motorically anticipate the auditory feedback of the partner and had slight asynchrony. So what you see here is increased activity in the left cerebellum in trials when they were slightly out of sync. Yeah, so where there were discrepancies, but only when they were familiar with the partner's part and had internal models. This effect was accompanied by a behavioral effect. And here we look at leg -1 cross correlations that indicate how strongly the pianist in the scanner adapted to the partner outside. And you see that this increase of activity is accompanied by a decrease in adaptation. So it is self-other segregation, if you will. And these two measures were also strongly correlated. So what we see is stronger cerebellar activity and weaker behavioral adaptation when pianists are familiar with their partner's actions. The interpretation we offer here is that our pianists use their internal models to predict the partner's action timing, and that they self-other segregated once these simulation-based predictions were not precisely met based on these asynchronies. All right, to sum up this second study, in a nutshell, we argue that cortico-cerebellar audio-motor networks link motor knowledge on the one hand and other produced sounds to balance self-other integration and segregation. And you will certainly hear more about this in the next talk by Ole Hegli. Okay, let's come to the last bit of the talk. It's still on duets, but now it's real dual brain approaches. So far, we have considered one pianist, even though it was an interaction, but now we are turning to real dual brain approaches. And we do so with dual EEG recordings. That's a figure that is drawn from Giacomo's 2016 paper. And actually the data, it's the same data that we reanalyzed with a dual brain approach. So two pianists playing again Bach chorales with the right and the left hand. It's the same setup. What you know from the literature is that the brains of interacting musicians synchronize. And that has been found already like 10, 12, 15 years ago by Uma Lindenberger and colleagues. And this raised the idea that interbrain synchrony is a neurocorrelate of social interaction that actually may underlie behavioral synchronization and coordination. But there is one essential problem here. So what we tend to believe, or what we like to believe, is that this interbrain synchrony has endogenous origins, that it is based on the alignment of some cognitive processes that are relevant for the interaction, such as timekeeping, temporal anticipation, and the like. But it could as well be that the interbrain synchrony emerges from the very trivial fact that both pianists or both musicians' brains just have the same sensory input, and they track the shared sensory input. And this leads to some, natural synchronization that has no functional relevance for interaction. The question is how to tease these two things apart, and that's pretty problematic because there's hardly any musical interaction without shared sensory input, right? And the answer was found by Akasha, and we are very proud that this came out last week, also in Cerebral Cortex, so check it out. And she capitalized on musical pauses as a silent interaction. Okay. Silent interaction. I just checked the chat. It said 5 minutes. Okay. So when pianists have a silence, or musicians have a silence in the performance, they are not just simply taking a break, but they are mentally continuing the interaction. So if you look at the paradigm that Kasha used, exact same paradigm as before, two pianists were performing duets together, the right hand, the left hand. You may remember that there was a silent pause, a 4 seconds pause between two phrases. And during this pause, pianists have to keep the tempo of the first phrase, but at the same time, they have to already anticipate and plan their entry of the second phrase and also the tempo of the second phrase. You see, we gave them instructions to change the tempo, to either speed up or to slow down to a predefined tempo that was practiced before. And the crucial manipulation was in this paradigm that sometimes pianists received incongruent tempo cues. So one pianist, as is shown here, was asked to speed up, and the other pianist was asked to slow down, which would lead to, well, discrepancies or different temporal and cognitive processes during the pause. The question is whether the interbrain synchrony during the pause would differ depending on whether the pianists plan to change tempo into the same direction or in opposite directions. And I will make this very short because Kasha also has a poster and you can come and see her. She found effects, indeed. She found effects in the gamma band, particularly in the gamma envelope, synchronization of gamma envelopes during the silent temporal planning. And she found stronger interbrain synchrony when they were planning the same tempo and lower interbrain synchrony when they planned different tempi. This effect was specific to real pairs, didn't occur in surrogate pairs. You can see this here in the F values, they just below threshold all the time. And as a third result, the interbrain synchrony predicted the similarity of pianists' tempo after the pause. So in a way, these results, and there are more results, more details to this study, suggest that interbrain synchrony is indeed a neurocorrelate of social interaction that is not merely driven by shared sensory input. So it can have endogenous origins on top of some exogenous origins, of course. To wrap up, we looked at 3 aspects of music production. First thing, we saw that lateral prefrontal cortex is a hub that integrates networks involved in the structural planning and in the motor planning during solo performance. We saw that self-other integration and segregation is balanced by cortico-cerebellar networks and most likely by internal models. And we argue that interbrain synchrony can act as a marker of social coordination. For those of you who are interested in this third intersection as a future perspective, one could think of studies on turn-taking and the use of structural cues, combinatorial system, to anticipate turn ends, for example. With this, let me thank you for your attention and all the people, great people who were involved in this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniela. really fascinating. I'm trying, you know, I'm not biased, of course.
Not biased at all, Peter.
So I don't yet see any questions in the chat. So maybe I can just follow up the last point you made, which I think is an interesting one, also in relation to what Anna Fivash was presenting in her talk, because that maybe sets the scene for expanding beyond music to other forms of communication, specifically verbal communication and conversation. But the thing I'm not clear about is whether one would make the same predictions about interbrain synchrony, because clearly the tempo is crucial in music, and it is in a different way, maybe in speech and conversation. Would one expect similar effects, or maybe different frequency bands, or what do you think?
Well, that's exactly the reason why I put the turn taking in this on the last slide, because that's more what is comparable, I think, between music and language, that you have one person talking and then the other replying. There are, in a way, there are very maybe less strict temporal grids, but there are temporal grids within which people interact. So that's visible in the length of pauses that seem to be between turns, that seem to be pretty standard. So when so we seem to follow some oscillation, some temporal grid when we interact. I'm not sure about frequency bands there. I think that requires much more research. But I like to present these three bubbles that I have with little extension, saying the combinatorial system is something we also see in language, the motor sequence is something we also see in speech, and the interactional synchrony is something we see in communication. And it would be really interesting to see whether there are parallels in the future.
Yeah, I agree. It ties together well, and it's a good way to organize things. It identifies, questions for a program of research in a kind of an ordered way, where the relationship between the processes and their overlap can be ascertained. We do have time for another question, if there is anyone who would like to ask Daniela something. The poster session, I assume that people are familiar how to get there to see. I see there's a question from Sonia in the Zoom chat.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I read it out for those people who, if they don't see it, in YouTube? So Daniela, these results from the Köhler et al. Study are really very interesting. So what is your take on the cerebellum here? How do you bring together the time sensitivity of the cerebellum with your interpretation of an interactive forward model?
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. And it's really great to have you here as the cerebellar expert, so to say. The temporal asynchronies that we had in our paradigm were really subtle, and I think it fits into the time sensitivity of the cerebellum that we see effects there. It also fits with the idea that the cerebellum holds internal models. When you go to the motor literature, it's always the first thing that pops up, that the cerebellum holds these internal models, and it has these inhibitory connections to motor regions, which we were discussing, but we are not quite clear yet. And we actually hope for the feedback of the reviewers on that. The paper is under review to see how the detection of temporal discrepancies between anticipated and perceived feedback affects or inhibits adaptation processes that we believe take place also in cortical regions.
Okay, and while we have, sorry, if we have a minute, I'll just see that Elvira's got a very interesting question here. So regarding study 3, could interbrain synchrony be leaking from the previous phrase? What about instead first measure IBS between participants, even manipulating that IBS, and then ask them to play together?
We have, I think, Giacomo is in the audience, if he could reply. So manipulating IBS, that was done in the past. Also, Peter, you were in this study as well, to use TACS to induce in-phase or anti-phase interbrain synchrony in a way. And this has an effect on interaction, on the tapping a tapping task. So that is a great study, 2017 in Scan, I believe.
That's right.
And I don't believe it's leaking from the previous phrase. So we can discuss this because we don't see any gamma modulations in the first phrase, and we have enough of a pause that it cannot be leaking. So we made sure that this is not the case.
I'm getting deja vu from the review and revision process,
yes.
right? Because we, of course, addressed something like that. I'm afraid I have to end it here. Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you for the questions, everyone, and we'll